This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home.
Hello, and thank you for joining us once again on what is the fourth episode of this latest Tory Leadership Election podcast. I am Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, and joining me in their habitual places is William Atkinson, our Assistant Editor, and the great Andrew Gimson, sketch writer extraordinaire, biographer of Boris, etc. I'm sure you all know the format by now, but I will recite it briefly for any new arrivals. We will first go to William for a look at the week ahead and what we do, significant dates and things to expect. Then all three of us will sort of pick apart the week that we've just had. And then at the end, William will give us his much anticipated winners and losers. So without further ado, William, what awaits us?
Well, one date for all party members' diaries should be the 4th of August, where we've got another televised hustings on Sky News. So for those of you unable to make a local hustings, that's your opportunity to see our two final candidates, Mr. Rishi Sunak and Ms. Elizabeth Truss, debate and go through the various issues of the week and what they would do as our next Prime Minister. But for those able to make any of the various hustings that the party is laying on across the country, we have one on the 1st of August in Exeter, and then we have one on the 3rd of August in Cardiff. So that will be an opportunity for party members to meet and quiz the candidates in person. And this will be especially useful because, as I mentioned last week, ballots will start to be received by party members on the 1st of August, and every party member should have received their ballots by the 5th of August. You have until 5 p.m. on the 2nd of September to vote. And remember, you are also able to, as we discussed last week, vote again online. And it's whichever vote of yours, which is the most recent, by the 2nd of September, which is the one that will actually count. As we can see, the contest is really hotting up, and the opportunities for quizzing the candidates and to see them are multiplying by the day.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, of course, we had our first hustings only last night. I trust that you both tuned in as loyal and avid Conservative journalists.
I was watching Love Island.
Deafening silence in the Conhome studios, it has to be said.
Contributor to Conservative Home, but I confess that last night I was writing up, was it only last night? I think it was. I was transcribing the text of a fascinating, exclusive interview carried out by William and myself with Liz Truss yesterday morning. And I'm afraid this was such an arduous task, and I was so anxious, of course, to get it right, that I didn't. And also, I knew that you would be monitoring this.
That's a crushing blow to my image that assumption was A, made, and B, correct. Well, okay, well, we'll come to those interviews in a moment. They're both now live, I think, on the website. So hopefully all of the readers will get an opportunity to enjoy them. But the hustings, which we'll have to skip over, I suppose, was really quite a strange one because you tuned in, it was advertised as starting at 7 o'clock. And at about 7:15, proceedings lumbered into life. And then there was just this sort of 45-minute death march there was a speech from a member of the National Convention, and then there was a speech from Andrew Stevenson, and then there was a speech from David Davis introducing Rishi Sunak, then there was a video introducing Rishi Sunak, then Rishi Sunak gave a speech, then there was a speech from James Cleverly introducing Liz Truss, then there was a video of Liz Truss, and then Liz Truss gave a speech, and then they announced a sort of comfort break and intermission. And the actual Q&A started at 8. And I given that I think most people are passingly familiar with who these people are at this point, I thought that they could probably have skipped the first hour of that whole circus. I'm just venting my resentments to the readership. I'm sorry about this. Anyway, let's talk about those interviews. So how did it go? You two got to do this because I was otherwise engaged. So let's talk about Truss first, I suppose, since we've mentioned that. How did that go? What came out of it?
William, what came out of it? Well, actually, there were two particularly striking moments. One was when William, as the voice of youth, made a reference to Taylor Swift, which was taken up by the candidate, Liz, a very avid, of course, all rather above my head. But I did make an audible contribution when Liz said that our best days lie ahead of us, and I'm afraid I gave a groan because I thought this is such a terrible cliche that no politician should ever allow themselves to say it. But of course, she wasn't put off. She was, if anything, stimulated by this groan and went on in an even more forceful manner to point out that she's an optimist and that our best days do lie ahead of us.
But what does that mean? Did she? Because I'm always fascinated by this because if you measure it in terms of kind of quality of life, then yes, I suppose everyone has a washing machine. They didn't have them in the Victorian era, etc. But obviously, we're never going to be a world-bestriding power again.
This is losing side.
Is it? This is maybe this is just Project Fear. But we can barely muster spending 2% on defence, including pensions and all the rest of it.
As Liz said, all this is just talking Britain down. This is declinism. Henry, why are you indulging in this outrageous scaremongering?
I have to say, and I do have to say this. This is the thing I really don't like about Liz's campaign, is the fact that whenever anyone goes, oh, but how are you going to pay for this or make this happen? She just goes, that's declinism, and there is loads of declinism, but for me, and obviously Conservative Home is not currently endorsing a candidate, and there's plenty wrong with both of them. I'm not going to take any lectures in declinism from somebody whose main proposal on housing is to get rid of housing targets and get nothing built, given that that's the main barrier to the prosperity that we all deserve. Also, brief sidebar on the sort of the relative perspectives on youth. I'm not entirely sure that Taylor Swift qualifies anymore. As a bold old man, have heard of Taylor Swift.
Yes,
she was big. She was big when I was away. Did any policy come out of it? Did she drop any sort of bombshells?
Well, so one central element of what I wanted to talk to her about, as our sort of nominal economics correspondent, was all this sort of Patrick Minford row that's been going on after Patrick Minford wrote an article and gave various interviews supporting her various tax-cutting proposals, but also suggested that he now claims he was misquoted, that in order for them to succeed, interest rates should go up to somewhere between 5 and 7%, and that a little bit of a recession would be no bad thing. Of course, I then asked Liz Truss, who's on record, saying that we need to change the Bank of England's mandate. Well, what would you change that mandate to? And do you think interest rates have been too low? And if so, should they be raised? And she didn't really answer that, to be fair. She just made the point that since the Bank of England's mandate was set by Gordon Brown in 1997, it's probably time that it should be changed, which sounds fair enough. But if she's got no actual idea of where it should be changed to, or at least not willing to say, then why would she at least raise the prospect of the Bank of England's mandate being changed? She's just going to make a lot of enemies at the Bank of England before she even enters number 10.
This was something that leapt out at me during the debates. Is Rishi? Rishi said the main economist who has backed this proposal is Patrick Minford. He said that part and parcel of this is that interest rates will spike and that this will be a good thing. And speaking as somebody who'd like to buy a house, obviously, if Liz Truss kicks the legs out from under the housing market, that would be great for me. I don't know if many Tory voters would agree with her. But all she really did was sort of denounce that bit of Patrick Minford's analysis. But I think it has to be taken as a package. Absolutely
right. William did ask both candidates whether they were going to abolish the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act.
Oh, sound. Oh, what was the? I suspect I can guess the answer. But what did they say?
Well, Rishi just said he couldn't commit to doing that. And Liz, it was a slightly more complicated answer, but basically the answer was no. But she said she wants these tax-free zones where the
those sort of investment zones, which are free ports but not free ports. She basically said that using various clauses of the Levelling Up Bill, etc., she would create areas in the country where it was easier to get things done and try to circumvent various elements of the nefarious 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, one of the worst pieces of legislation, one must say, this country has ever passed, etc., etc. But she wasn't really specific on how that would be done.
They never are. My personal view is that a properly ruthless Tory party, such as the left continue to believe exists, would recognise there are only about 5 marginal seats in London. We don't need any of them to form a government, and simply table a metropolitan planning bill, which would just suspend and tear up the entire post-war planning order, but only for London. And you'd sell that to the Shire Tory MPs by saying, look, if we allow all the Londoners and people who want to be Londoners to stay in London, we won't have to build in any of your villages. You could probably even get Bob Seeley to vote for that.
I thought you were going to cover Amersham in concrete.
Well, I would separately, through primary legislation, turn Chesham and Amersham into an exurb of London. Generic Garden City.
I would say, though, as my girlfriend lives in Amersham, please don't necessarily sort of carpet over the entirety of
the no, the whole thing. I went to school in Chesham. I could carpet the whole thing. So 600,000 Tory voters, 3 tube stations. It'd be glorious. But I suppose since we've mentioned Rishi, we should also talk about the other interview, which I'm guessing, given your question, predated his announcement that he was going to gold plate the green belt. Despite so, what came out of that? What were the highlights of the Rishi chat?
I felt he was a very solid, sound person who and who's making a courageous fight of it, but somehow he doesn't connect in the same way that, I mean, I liked him actually, and I respect him. But there was this slight, he couldn't quite, I wasn't fully satisfied by his explanation that he's in favour of sound money, and yet he wants this VAT cut. Admittedly, I mean, he said his argument is that that's temporary, so cutting in order to reduce fuel bills. But yeah, I don't know.
I found this about Rishi's campaign, which is whatever you thought of it, and I confess I was probably better disposed towards it than many Tory members. But right up until the aftermath of that Sun debate this week, you could respect him because whether or not you agreed with his analysis, he was clearly arguing from principle on tax and public spending and all the rest of it. And then he had that tax U-turn. And all of a sudden, I think that was the moment, I suspect, and I might be wrong, but I suspect that might be seen as the beginning of the end of his campaign. Because he ceded the initiative. Because once you're fighting on, once the terrain of the campaign is tax cuts, Liz Truss wants more of them. She wants them faster, and she clearly actually believes in them, whereas Rishi doesn't.
Yes.
And then we got this second announcement yesterday, I think, that he's going to remove council's ability to discretionarily redesignate greenbelt land for development. And it's quite obviously pandering. And I don't think that if you're not well disposed towards Rishi in the first place, it's going to appeal to you. And I think that if you did respect him before, I mean, I don't know, how's this playing with the youth?
Well, as the nominal Gone Home voice of youth and defender of Taylor Swift, it seems, I would say that
it just said I knew who she was.
I'm actually distantly related to her, which is a sort of bizarre fact. But I mean,
what a tiny world we live in. Maybe we can get her on the podcast.
yeah. If Paul hasn't rejoined us next week, I'm sure Taylor can take Andrew's place.
They won't have to dance. No dancing.
But so I would say it does strike me that one of the reasons why Rishi, when Chancellor, decided not to go ahead with the VAT sort of fuel duty cut a few months ago was because it was thought to, not the fuel duty cut, sorry, the cut in VAT basically on energy bills. The reason why it was the government decided not to go ahead with it, and he personally decided not to go ahead with it because it would disproportionately help those with, I think, larger houses and larger energy bills, so they would tend to be wealthier. And now, along with the sort of I'm going to protect the green belt, etc., sort of fluff that he gave us yesterday, it does seem like he's trying to tailor his, no pun intended, his approach towards disproportionately older home-owning Tory members, which is perhaps a good way, if you're trying to fight as he is, to try and catch up and be an actual contender in this leadership race, to try and win over Tory members. But in terms of actually creating policy, is very short-sighted and doesn't actually think about the Tory party's long-term prospects.
So let's talk about policy, because I think one of the interesting things about this week, and I don't know if it's sort of a testament to the different format of the debates, is that we have finally started to see the candidates limping out of this rut that they've been in on tax. They're still mostly talking about tax and tax cuts. But we had Liz Truss making a commitment on Northern Powerhouse Rail. We've had Rishi Sunak briefly mentioning, I'm massively intrigued by this, but he briefly mentioned yesterday that he was in favour of new grammar schools in a throwaway question from Nick Ferrari. And so, I mean, do we my hope is that the reason I backed to having a full leadership contest, as in when Boris eventually toppled, is precisely because I thought that the party needed to have this much more wide-ranging debate. Do we think that's starting to emerge? Are either of you optimistic that over the course of the next month or so of hustings, we're going to end up with two relatively comprehensive and coherent Conservative programmes, or are we going to get to the end of it simply having had some bidding war over tax cuts and a couple of other bits and bobs?
I think it's going to be more of a bidding war. And it did take Margaret Thatcher and the many very able people working with her. I mean, they needed 4 years, really. Admittedly, in some ways, the problems were more obvious in 1975 and even more serious, I think. But it took them 4 years to work out what they were going to do about it. I don't think it's something you can really do in a month.
No, I suppose Britain's problems are, I suppose, not obvious if you cannot, for political reasons, conclude that it's build more houses.
Well,
William?
Yeah, so I think the problem is that it would have been more worthwhile for the party if those in seat HQ, the powers that be, hadn't got frit at the prospect of a Royal Mail strike next month, disrupting the actual returning of the leadership ballots, and hadn't decided to bring the point to which the ballots went out to the 1st of August. Because the problem we now face is that we've had the bulk of this campaign, the bulk of actually trying to win over party members, compressed into about a week, because on current assumptions, it's thought that a half, perhaps more, party members will vote as soon as they get the ballots in. So that's why Rishi's had this mad rush this week to try and catch up. He's clearly hasn't been successful in doing so. And I think as a consequence, a lot of the hustings we're going to see over the next month aren't overtly useful because it's going to be the two of them sort of trading for the votes of party members who may well have already voted. And B, because as you say, we live Telegraph headline by Telegraph headline, and that's no way to actually make policy. And neither candidate has had very long to think about what they would actually want to do in office because they've been too busy focused on their respective roles. Though if you're Liz Truss, you've at least been showing a bit of leg to the ASI and the IA for quite a while now. But I would say, yes, Andrew's entirely right to say neither has really thought up a sort of concerted programme for government. And frankly, one would hope that the Tory party had finally worked out what it wanted to do after 12 years in government, but it seems that we still haven't managed to do that.
It is fascinating the way that the sort of the needs and priorities of Tory members and key constituencies is shaping the race, because I don't know if either of you tuned in to the abortive Sun showdown on Talk TV on Tuesday evening. This was the latest televised debate. Again, another deafening silence.
I was watching Love Island, I must admit.
From our media team. Or maybe
also, it was the day that I graduated from university, so I think I get a free pass on that one.
Well, okay, you got one free pass, but you missed two debates, young Padawan. One thing that leapt out to me, the tragic sad sack who apparently watches all of these things on your behalf, is that Liz Truss has been going around this campaign touting herself as a free trader, signing all of these trade deals. And there was a really striking moment in the Sun debate, which again had questions from ordinary members of the public, or Sun readers, to the extent that they are the same thing. And she said, look, I can't afford to buy my family meat every day of the week anymore. I can only afford to buy meat twice a week, and the rest of the time my family are having to eat vegetarian. We're not vegetarians, but we simply can't afford it. And that was, I think, a really striking preview of what being actually quite a poor country is going to look like if the United Kingdom stays on its current trajectory. And the interesting thing for the sort of historically minded, which both of you are, is that free trade, the great cause of free trade back in the day was cheap food. Of course. This was the dividing line. It was full shops, the import. And I was thinking, okay, Liz Truss is clearly leaning on this tradition quite heavily. Will she just say, well, we'll strike trade deals to get cheap food in from overseas and put meat back on your table? And she couldn't do it because both she and Rishi Sunak represent farming constituencies. Yes. British voters, they want the highest animal welfare standards in the world, and they want to, stop importing food that doesn't meet it. And so it was just this weird disconnect between the rhetoric of the campaign, the free tradey rhetoric, and the actually quite prescriptive and protectionist reality. It's sort of like imperial protection, but we don't have an empire anymore. So it's just protection, which is a slightly sadder prospect. Okay, so final question before we move on to William's winners and losers is on the subject of policy, which I confess to being probably too interested in. What's one area that is currently being neglected in the leadership race that each of you would like to see the candidates forced to address? Andrew.
Crumbs. Well, I'm not really I've always been rather weak on the policy side of things. The union with Scotland is whether they ought to have something, and indeed the union with Northern Ireland as well. These are very important fundamental things which have not been properly sorted out since Brexit and need to be. So.
That's true. The interesting thing is that Rishi has actually said some stuff about Scotland, but he has. No, it's fine. He said he's going to be more proactive at bypassing Holyrood, whereas Liz Truss hasn't really said anything about Scotland. On Northern Ireland, there's another interesting division, which is Truss, for better or worse, owns Northern Ireland because she tabled the protocol bill. And there's, to some extent, Rishi Sunak is hiding behind that bill because in the hustings yesterday, he said, we have a bill that's going to sort that out and I support that bill. Now, he actually opposed that bill in cabinet. But the interesting thing is, and I really want to see the Truss campaign press him on this, is that the bill is an enabling bill. It doesn't, just by passing, actually fix the protocol. It gives the Secretary of State and the government the power to set aside parts of the protocol. So what we need to hear from Rishi is, as and when this bill becomes law, what are you actually going to do? Which parts of the sea border are you going to set aside in order to, protect the integrity of the UK? We've not had that yet. William, policy area neglected. You can't have the union, and nor can I, tragically, so I'm going to have to think something else.
Well, I think the obvious thing to say would be housing. As I tried to press both of the candidates on this, And I even suggested, as you did, that it would be nice if interest rates were jacked up, just so we had a sort of mortgage crisis, just so those of us desperate to get on the housing ladder and move out of my old room would finally be able to do so. But I think one area that's not necessarily policy, but which both candidates haven't really perhaps been pressed on as much as they should, is what they actually think of the governments that both of them have been part of for the last 2.5 years. They've been asked, would they have Boris Johnson? Well, actually 3 years, sorry, at this point. They've both been asked, would they want Boris Johnson in the cabinet? Both have said no. But when we actually pressed them on how bound they felt by the manifesto in 2019, both basically gave us quite obfuscatory answers. And I think Liz Truss was willing to say, it's a very good manifesto, etc., while simultaneously proposing sort of tax cuts, £40 billion worth, that in line with the spending commitments that she also wants to maintain, such as on health and social care, for example, and all of the sort of 20,000 new police officers, 40 new hospitals, etc., we will remember from 2019, would mean that the Tory party has pretty much finally decided to junk in the old idea that tax cuts have to actually be paid for by spending cuts. And now we are an official party of Reaganism, which is fine if that's what you want and you're willing to see inflation tick up a little bit. But it's also more difficult then to turn around at the next election or any future election and say, well, you can't trust the Labour Party because they've got a magic money tree and they're saying they're not going to raise taxes, but they're also going to raise spending, and that is just not on. And I would rather not necessarily sell our traditional reputation for fiscal competence down the water just to win a single leadership election.
Has to be said, from a political level, there is probably no better argument for getting rid of open leadership contests than asking two members of the cabinet to spend time taking lumps out of the government they previously served in. But on a deeper philosophical level, you are, of course, entirely right. Well, since you guys have taken housing in the union, which suggests I'm either very in touch or very predictable, I am going to go for education, because I think it's a vitally important area of policy which the Conservatives neglect more often than not. There was a brief period under Michael Gove when we really did seem to understand that this was actually crucial to shaping the future shape of British society. And, we had bits and bobs. Liz Truss has talked a lot about how her schooling apparently turned her into a Thatcherite, yet hasn't really got an education policy as far as I can see. Rishi Sunak apparently likes grammar schools. I'm not sure if that's just part of Operation Panda or not, but I'd like to hear more details about that. So education, the union, and housing, an excellent trinity of things, which hopefully we'll be able to press the candidates on in the weeks to come. So, with that done, it's time for our favourite section, William's Winners and Losers. William.
Well, I would have to say the winner of this week has been Liz Truss. We remember, cast our minds back to what now seems like ancient history, but back when we still had 5 candidates in this leadership election. We remember that debate that had all 5 of them in them. Liz Truss was thought to have come stone dead last in that, and it looked for a brief moment like her campaign might be floundering, that she'd be overtaken by Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch. But since then, with every passing appearance that she makes, she seems more assured, she seems more comfortable in the role, and it seems that party members actually do really like her. We've seen polling, both from us and from other less reputable sources, suggesting that she's at least 20 points ahead of Rishi Sunak. And I think she's increasingly seen to be the winner of these various hustings. It seems that Rishi Sunak's approach of telling party members what they don't want to hear, and Liz Truss's approach of telling party members what they do want to hear, is actually being much more effective for the person who tells party members what they actually want to hear, and to promise them a government, quite frankly, that they want to see, which will deliver tax cuts, will fight the culture wars, and give them apple pie and all the rest. And so, as we're now down to a final 2, that of course means that the person who's had a bad week has to be Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak had to absolutely smash it out of the park this week if he wanted to try and get level or anywhere near level with Liz Truss before the ballots go out. He simply hasn't done that. Now, parts of that are not his fault. The fact that the Sun/Talk TV debate was curtailed halfway through. But the fact is that, as you say, his VAT promise wasn't really trusted because he's made such a big part of his campaign to be opposing any form of tax cuts. And then his planning proposals and his defence of the Green Belt lost him the support of any Tory member under the age of 40, though I must admit there's probably not too many of us. And also the fact that he spent so much time dealing with what are basically seen as personal issues, so whether he's too wealthy, whether he's stabbed Boris in the back, or even whether he's actually been mansplaining to Liz Truss when he interrupts her during debates. Of course, those listening can't hear me doing air quotes with that. Yes, I'd suggest that Rishi Sunak had to have the best possible week, and he really hasn't. So as a consequence, he was behind at the start of this week. He is still behind now. And now the one caveat I would add to that is that as somebody who's obviously very interested in economics, the whole Minford row from earlier this week and the fact that Liz Truss was unable to tell us what she really thinks of interest rates suggests there are still some big holes in Trussonomics. And I think quite a few commentators I quite respect are becoming increasingly sceptical of Trussonomics. So if Rishi Sunak is able to push home the advantage on that, or at least outflank her when it comes to red meat, we haven't had much talk about the European Court of Human Rights, for example, and the Rwanda policy. So if Sunak is able to actually show Tory members that he both provides competence and a proper economic understanding, as well as the various bits of red meat, or should we say blue meat, though that sounds like it's gone off, that we're looking for, then he might be able to roar back into this race. But I say at the moment, I don't think it looks very likely.
Fair enough. I'll just add a quick caveat to say that all of our good friends at the British Polling Council and Associated Pollsters, we mean no slur to your reputation. It's just very unfortunate that the Conservative Home Survey continues being as accurate as it is.
I would say on that, I was at a party earlier in the week, and I was speaking to a fellow Tory party member who started complaining about the polling that's been done on this race so far, saying that, oh, YouGov, you don't survey enough people. And then he went on a rant all about Conservative Home and the fact that our methods aren't scientific, etc., without knowing what I did for a living. So I did get a great amount of satisfaction when I then informed him I was the assistant editor and corrected him on 1 or 2 points.
Oh, there we go. Well, ultimately, I take quite a sort of Gnostic view of the survey, in that I'm very happy to. I don't really. The internal mechanisms of it are very mysterious, but it does seem to produce the right answers. So I'll keep sacrificing chickens to it for as long as I need to. So thank you, all of you, for your patience and for joining us once again. It's been an absolute pleasure. This has been Henry Hill, William Atkinson, and Andrew Gimson, and we will be back next week. I think Paul is back and then gone again. So I think the editor will once again...
He's temporarily back from Las Vegas.
He's temporarily back.
Yeah.
But wherever it is that Paul goes. But I don't know if he'll be here next week. So we will either have Andrew or another guest. But thank you very much, and we'll rejoin you then.